You are listening to the Oddities of Violence podcast, a podcast about ideas and events from the margins of terrorism, genocide, and the philosophy of violence. This podcast is recorded at the CJSW 90.9 FM studios at the University of Calgary in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, which is located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Your hosts are Gavin Cameron, Josh Goldstein, and Maureen Hebert. We're all on faculty here in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Just a caution before we get started, this podcast is for a mature audience and deals with topics, commentary, and depictions of events that some listeners may find difficult or distressing. Hello everyone, welcome to the Oddities of Violence podcast. I'm the host for this episode, Josh Goldstein. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Gavin Cameron.
Hi Josh.
And Maureen Hebert.
Hi Josh.
Great to be in the studio with you again, Gavin and Maureen. In this episode, we're again probing the margins of the philosophy of violence. We'll be having a conversation about the relationship between violence, reality, and ideas, in the thought of an important, but relatively unknown, mid-20th century philosopher, Eric Voegelin. And joining us today is one of our Oddities of Violence workshop contributors, as well as our colleague, Barry Cooper. We're talking with Barry in person in the CJSW studio. Hello, Barry.
Hello, everybody.
Thanks for being here. It's so nice to have this opportunity to have a conversation and to work with you professionally. Barry and I have been on many student thesis examination committees and many committee work together, but we've never had a chance to talk as political philosophers in a professional setting like this, so it's a wonderful thing and really looking forward to it. As I just mentioned, Barry is a political philosopher and a professor of political science here at the University of Calgary, where he has been for just over 4 decades. His education stretches from Shawnigan Lake School on Vancouver Island to the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and to a PhD at Duke University in North Carolina. Our listening audience may know Barry from his more public and political commentary, but he's also a prolific scholar with over 35 books translated, edited, or authored, many supported through major research grants from national and international funding agencies. Barry has been honored with the Konrad Adenauer Award from the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung and a Killam Research Fellowship. He's been a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada since 1993. Through the decades, there are 2 threads running through Barry's very diverse work. One thread in Barry's work is the attempt to make sense of the world by making sense of how individuals and groups think about the world and their place in it, whether it be the response to COVID in Canada or how human communities lived and thought in the Stone Age. The second thread in Barry's writings is the place of the 20th century German-American political philosopher Eric Voegelin. In just a moment, we'll turn to how Voegelin can help us think about modern political violence, whether in terrorism or the horror of genocide. But let's begin, as we always do, with our guests. Barry, can you tell us a bit about your origin story, how you started out here in Alberta and ended up back here in Alberta as a political philosopher, and all the important stuff in between?
All the important stuff in between, yes. Well, my dad's family comes from Nanton, which is about 40 miles south of town. His grandfather homesteaded, and there's stories within my family that my great-grandfather's wife was a Tsuut'ina woman. I've never verified that by looking at birth certificates, but it's part of the family lore in any case. And I was educated out in BC. And at UBC, at the time, UBC was probably had the best political science department in Canadian politics. So I learned a lot of Canadian politics that still stands me in good stead today. And I went to Duke because my honor supervisor there went to Duke. A guy named Ed Black. So that's how I ended up in North Carolina. But I changed my major from Canadian and comparative to political philosophy because of a very good teacher there, John Hallowell, who was a friend of Voegelin's. So I met Voegelin as well at that time. So it was a very exciting place to be. I mean, there was nothing. There was no interstate highway from Durham to either Washington or Atlanta, so you were stuck there with nothing but about 5 million books in the library. So I had plenty of work to do. Anyway, I taught for about 10 years in Quebec and Ontario before I came back to Alberta.
Okay. And was there a reason that you moved from out east back home?
Yeah, I hated Toronto.
Okay.
and Tony Perel was the department head then. I'd known him. He was also a political philosopher. He's a Machiavelli scholar. Mm-hmm. And I was in Vienna, actually. He phoned me in Vienna and said, would you like to come up to audition for a job at Calgary? And I said, you bet. So I came out for a weekend. Tom Halke, who's a dean at UBC in Kelowna, was in the class. It was a 310 class. And he said he could still remember the lecture that I gave. I completely forgot what it was. He told me it was about Alexander the Great. So anyway, Tony Perel recruited me here.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. It's been wonderful to have you in the department. I've been here. All of us have been here just a fraction of the time you have. But it's been wonderful to share our love of political philosophy together and to offer the kinds of courses that we have. Now, one course that we haven't offered, as far as I can recall, is on Eric Voegelin. And Barry, in our Oddities of Violence workshop, your contribution is to introduce us to Eric Voegelin and Eric Voegelin's philosophy of violence in particular. And to help orient our readers, can you first give us a big picture of Eric Voegelin's thought? As a philosopher, what was he interested in and why? And then after, we'll get you to pivot to how he came to be interested in violence in particular as a political philosopher. And I assume, given that Voegelin fled Vienna in 1938 with the German annexation of Austria, that his experience of Nazism must be crucial to this second story of how violence came to be important to him. But start us off with the big picture.
Yeah, the big picture. He was a student of Hans Kelsen, and he started off basically as a lawyer. Kelsen had drafted the Austrian Constitution after World War I and was probably the most important jurist in Europe at the time. Mm-hmm. Voegelin went to the United States in 1925 and 26 on a Laura Spelman Rockefeller exchange program, and he said that he had a new world, intellectual world, open to him that had nothing to do with all of the neo-Kantian debates surrounding Kelsen's jurisprudence. So he said, when I got back to Germany, Heidegger had just published Sein und Zeit, and he said, it was like water off a duck's back. I'd moved on. And what happened in the rest of the 20s and into the 30s, you might say he was mugged by political reality. He wrote a couple of books. He wrote one book on the United States in 1928, and then in 1933 he wrote two books on race. One, the idea of race, and the other called Race and State, because everybody was talking about it. Particularly in Germany, that got him onto the list of people that the Nazis didn't much like. He wasn't Jewish. He was sort of Lutheran, I guess, and he stayed in Vienna as a private Privatdozent, as a adjunct professor or something like that. And after the Anschluss, after the annexation in 1938, he had written this book called The Political Religions, and that I sort of took part of the title with the book I did on terrorism, and it came out in April of 1938, which was a month after the Anschluss. So he knew that he was not going to be staying in Austria for very long. A few copies got out. One of them found its way to Thomas Mann's study, and Mann wrote him a letter telling him what he didn't like about it. So then a second edition came out after Voegelin left, and his leaving Vienna was also a real adventure. He made it up by the skin of his teeth. There were Gestapo people outside his flat.
Wow.
And he spent, as spies always do, they spent the afternoon in the movie theater and took the train to Zurich that evening. But so anyway, he just made it out. But in the second edition that was published in Stockholm, he gave an answer to Thomas Mann that introduces one of the themes that goes throughout his work, particularly with respect to violence. I'm sure you all know who Herzl Grynszpan was.
Well, let's tell our readers who.
And if any of them don't, he was the guy that assassinated a Gestapo member in the Paris embassy named Ernst von Ruth, or von Ruth or von Roth. And the next night or 2 days later, after this guy died, Kristallnacht was perpetrated in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Voegelin wrote a preface in the second edition that said that this guy basically did his duty by shooting this Gestapo, and it's probably something that would be called terrorism nowadays, for sure. You don't go around shooting government officials, even if they're Nazis. Voegelin said this was a perfectly understandable use of pragmatic violence, because he said Jews in Vienna and in Germany had been treated as if they were not human. And if that's the way you're going to behave towards me, I certainly have a duty to shoot you. That was the gist of his response to Thomas Mann. What I would call that is the kind of commonsensical way of understanding violence. And when Voegelin came to write a lot of his material, that for which he's probably more famous, starting with a book, a 5-volume book called Order and History, he started off with Egypt and Mesopotamia, and he made an argument there, and in his History of Political Ideas that never was published, that all regimes have to use violence to defend themselves. Defense of the realm is what we call it in medieval philosophy, and that this was simply a condition of acting politically. That stayed with him throughout his career, and it is a form of violence that may be a kind of mortgage on the ethical purity of political regimes, but it's inescapable.
That's a excellent story. Can you tell us a little bit? There's two interesting experiences that seem to be here. One is the experience of America as this new world that shakes him out of the now stale academic debate, and the experience of Nazism. Was there any relationship between those two experiences? Did he see the Nazis in a new way because he had been to America?
I think so. One of the things that he learned in America, particularly at his time at Wisconsin with Americanists there, was the importance of common sense. As he learned a lot of other stuff when he was in New England, but their common sense as the foundation for political life was really important. And when he returned to Germany, and this was still in the late 1920s, so the Nazis were not really on the scene, he maintained that. He did a number of articles on German politics of interest, now to almost nobody. But they were very commonsensical. And all of the methodological debates that so beset North American social science after the war, he just thought it was a waste of time. It was, from Max Weber on, he said, all this stuff is has been settled. Common sense from the Scottish Enlightenment through to New England, through to the kind of generalities of American intellectual life. That's where you begin. And his America book was called On the Form of the American Mind, or Geist, the American Spirit. And it's all about that. So he was kind of inoculated and certainly would not make the kind of mistakes that so many European scholars did with respect to the Nazis. He said, these are bad people. That's where we got to begin. Not, how does their legal order compute with, say, the Weimar Republic? He said, this is not the point.
Wow. This emphasis on common sense, from what I understand, and what we'll try and get you to say a little bit more about as we lay out Voegelin's philosophy of violence, is that we have this common sense violence, as you said, a pragmatic response to the needs to keep the state, the political community from being overwhelmed by enemies, opposing forces. And this contrasts, you say, with another conception of violence, which Voegelin calls magical. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate then on what this idea of magical violence is, what it means, and how it differs from the common sense understanding of violence?
Yeah, Voegelin used a number of different terms to describe this alternative one. Magic was a fairly late one. He began it by talking about the Old Testament, particularly about Isaiah, and the debates that he had with the king as to how they were going to deal with some invaders. And you probably remember this from your time as a dutiful scholar, as a young man. Isaiah basically said you have to trust in God. God will take care of it. All that the Egyptians have are chariots and an army. Mm-hmm. So trust in God. Fortunately, the king threw Isaiah in jail and didn't listen to him because he knew that you also had to have chariots and infantry to deal with chariots and infantry, that God was not going to do it on his own. Voegelin initially called that metastatic faith. And it's a term that he used probably for about 2 years, and then he never used it again. He used other terms that sort of have a resonance with it, but it means kind of hyper faith. Mm-hmm. That you, as if you could compel God to defend the children of Israel, and that's the way Voegelin read this debate between Isaiah and the king. And that there was something the matter with Isaiah. The king still had some common sense, but Isaiah was living in this imaginary universe where he knew the will of God, and he could tell the king what God had in mind. And the king said, I don't think so. There's the contrast. That was the first contrast that between these two understandings of violence that Voegelin developed. There are Christian versions of this as well. He developed a lot of these in a book, probably his most famous book, called The New Science of Politics, that came out in 1952. And the Christian version initially had to do with the parousia, the second coming, mm-hmm. And how you could speed it up. The latest, the longest analysis in the New Science is about the Puritan armies as being an angelic host, and what commonsensical analysts like Hooker thought of that, which was not much. They were not an angelic host; they were an army, and if you could think that you were part of an angelic host, you could basically commit atrocities without having to worry that, in fact, you would be held responsible for what were atrocities. These were not. These were all already God had forgiven you. That's a kind of what he later called magical thinking or second reality thinking. Now, The other thing that comes with this that he mentioned from time to time is that there's also a kind of metastatic disappointment when the world is not transformed. The world remains the way it is. And he says, quite, I think, absolutely correctly, that in Book 20 of the City of God, St. Augustine deals with this question sort of theoretically as well as can be done at any time. When he talks about what made the Roman Empire great, it was their armies. What made them succumb to Alaric, the armies weren't any good anymore. It had nothing to do with the removal of the altar of victory from the Palatine Hill. It was a matter of military competence. That's commonsensical. So everybody, whether you're a pagan Roman, a Christian expecting the parousia to come tomorrow, or Isaiah, you could have these metastatic expectations, which he later discussed in terms of Gnosticism, that would never come true. And you had to deal with that too.
So today, between ideas of common sense and this metastatic faith, this magical belief, and I think Voegelin also uses the term second reality. Today, we have a tendency when we think about the kind of commitments that individuals have, that groups or communities have, we tend to think in terms of ideology, so common sense or ideological view. Now, I know you also teach an introductory course on political ideologies. So where does our term ideology fit, or where would Voegelin see our term ideology fitting in between common sense and this magical belief?
It depends how far you push the ideologists.
Okay.
And most of us are ideological in some way or another. We're liberals or conservatives or socialists or whatever. And I tell the students in the class that we should think of ideology as a convention. And so I go back to the difference between nomos and physis in Greek philosophy.
And can you tell our listeners what those words mean?
Yeah, between nature and convention. And ideologies are the modern version of conventions, so that we may not be able to escape them, but we shouldn't mistake them for being truth. And they have assumptions that we have to interrogate. And that's what you do when you are a political scientist. You raise questions, you look for the logic of an argument, you do an analysis. And the students, eventually they come to get this, at least most of them do. And I talk a bit about second realities with Don Quixote, in fact. And they get that pretty quickly. In the second external trip of Don Quixote, he has Sancho Panza with him, who is the Cervantes version of common sense. And Sancho then, he tells the Don, those are not giants, those are windmills. And he says, no, they're giants. And so he said, oh yeah, they're giants, because I have these transformers here that I can fix them and change them from windmills to giants. And I said, so now, I tell the students that now Sancho Panza is becoming inducted into the second reality of Don Quixote. And I explain why from, what Cervantes says. And the students get it. It's, he says, yeah, they say, yeah, we can see how you could live in this world of imagination. And I mean, that's basically all it is a kind of a epistemological statement. It's not really that hard.
Okay. No, this is really great. And before we turn it over to our co-host to extend the conversation to questions of terrorism and to genocide, I just wanted to ask this one last very general question: is common sense always resistant to magical thinking, or is common sense always susceptible to magical thinking? Is there a movement that we have to be, or that we should be careful of, that common sense becomes ideological, becomes magical, or are they distinct enough? Each common sense is resistant to magical thinking, and so on.
Common sense is pretty much resistant if you can maintain it, and that's always you're always tempted towards a solution to questions that have no solutions, and everyone is all the time. Your common sense can resist that, but not always, not always, and then you can believe in anything, and that's the that, at least the way Voegelin looks at it, that becomes the capitulation to magic thinking. But he also says nobody is compelled to be an ideologist. Nobody is compelled to believe in magic. And I sometimes I teach Macbeth in the Machiavelli course, and I do the same sort of thing there with the witches. The Act 1, Scene 1, they're right there. And I once asked the class, how many of you believe in witches? And there was only one kid that put up his hand, and he was an exchange student from Africa. And so I asked him to explain what witches were, and he did. And I then said, well, how many of you believe in evil? And more hands went up. So it's a question of how you symbolize these things. I think for a lot of people, you don't do it magically because that just leads to confusion. And you can always explain using your common sense why witches. You don't have to believe in witches, but there's evil out there.
That's great. Let's turn the conversation over to our co-host, Gavin Cameron, to look at the relationship between belief and terrorism.
Thanks, Josh. So, Barry, you've already talked about your book on terrorism, New Political Religions. And one of the ways that you sort of have written about terrorism is to tie the ideas of Voegelin into the issue of terrorism. So could you just sort of put those two pieces together for our listeners in a way that they can sort of understand the argument that you make in your work?
Well, I can try. One of the things that I was interested in when I wrote that book was how those who advocated terrorism understood what they were doing, and this returns us to this question of second realities, because one of the things that Voegelin said about it is that you're never entirely unaware that you're living in an imaginary world. And with Aum Shinrikyo, but also with Hezbollah, the leaders, Asahara, for example, said that he was going to tupoa people. Now, poa is a term that comes from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and it's not an active verb. And he must have known that. It was a euphemism for murder. And he could not know that. In the Islamic tradition, particularly with Hezbollah, there was a guy named Fadlallah, who was a very important religious leader in, Lebanon or Syria? I can't remember. But he invented one fine day the notion of self-martyrdom. Now, in Islam, there is no such thing as self-martyrdom. It's like self-sainthood if you're a Catholic. I'm just going to become a saint. No, it doesn't work that way. To become a martyr or a saint, you have to go through a process. There has to be the equivalent of a devil's advocate saying this guy does not deserve to be a martyr. He didn't do it for the glory of God. He did it for his own glory. So you have, and certainly Fadlallah knew that. So you had these terrorist leaders, I guess you might want to call them, who made things up and who knew they were making things up and did it anyway. And I found that very peculiar. Certainly, I think that was true with bin Laden as well. He must have known that what he was doing was not sanctioned by anything in the Quran.
Okay, thank you. And incidentally, Bin Laden had your book on his shelf, didn't he? So
That's what I've heard.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
that's what I've heard. Apparently, it was picked up by SEAL Team 6 when they paid him a visit, but I've never seen it. I tried to get access to it when I was in D.C. at the CIA library, but they wouldn't let me in.
Fair enough. Okay. So, I mean, you've just sort of talked about a sort of particular version of sort of the belief that underpinned Hezbollah, and you've talked about Shinrikyo, and certainly Shinrikyo's belief set was very complicated, and Shoko Asahara made all sorts of predictions that clearly were not coming true. There was a clash between this sort of magical element, this second reality, and the reality that was sort of impinging on him. And so there's a crisis there, and certainly in the context of Shinrikyo, that the answer to that crisis is violence. But we also have lots and lots of evidence of terrorism that is much more pragmatic, where it's instrumental, where the level of violence is being moderated as a sort of means of political coercion. So are we sort of saying that we can explain all terrorism using this clash between second reality or magic and common sense reality? Or are we saying that they sort of coexist? And if so, how do they coexist?
Well, I think they coexist. They coexist in the same way that pragmatic violence can coexist with magical thinking too. I mean, with Shinrikyo, there was one of Asahara's predictions actually came true. The big earthquake at Kyoto or someplace Kobe. Yeah. And so that gave him a lot of credit. I mean, he obviously knew what he was talking about. The idea of propaganda by deed is basically pragmatic violence, I would say. And it's a way, it's kind of like public relations. I mean, you know all of this way better than I do. It is something that, even though it may horrify most of us as being a gratuitous murder, for those to whom it appeals, it is pragmatic, it has an appeal, and it is a good recruiting device. Yep. So it's not magic there. There may be some people who think that because Asahara predicted this earthquake, he can predict all of the other things that he predicted. That's magic. And that may be something that would recruit people for whom magic is something that they believe in. I think a lot of people were recruited to Shinrikyo on that basis. I mean, some of the things that were their confessions to the various Japanese authorities would suggest that they were not living in the pragmatic, commonsensical world that the rest of us normally like to think we live in anyway.
And this is precisely one of the problems with Shinrikyo as a case, because it's right on the boundary between terrorism. Certainly it's using terrorism as a tactic, but at the more sort of existential level, is it really a terrorist organization, or is it actually a cult? And one of the things that we're trying to sort of get at if we talk about that, it is exactly what you've just discussed, sort of how its belief set affected the ability of its members to make judgments about what's real and what's not, and the role of Shoko Asahara clearly was important within that.
Yeah, absolutely, and it was also abetted by Japanese law.
Yes,
that made it possible for someone like that to gain a public following.
Yes,
and very easily slip over into what we would call terrorism anyway.
Yes, and in fact, Japanese law actively protected it as a religious organization. Yeah. There's all sorts of ways that sort of constitutional protections. So the overt religious element is actually a very important part of that story. Mm-hmm. Since we're sort of talking a little bit about how we understand terrorism as a phenomenon, one of the sort of standard elements in traditional accounts, traditional definitions of terrorism, is the idea of violence as a form of coercive bargaining. And if we take Voegelin's idea of this sort of clash between the magical and common sense reality, it's not clear actually, I would say in many cases, who or what is being coerced. Mm-hmm. So do you think you could sort of just explain how the coercive element of sort of standard definitions of terrorism might apply in the case of this sort of Voegelin account of magic versus common sense reality?
Well, I think if you look, he would say something along these lines. I think if you look at the motivations for individuals who undertake terrorist actions, you have to interrogate them not simply in terms of propaganda by deed or anything other along those lines that is pragmatic. He would say something like this. You remember Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach? Probably not. Philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. And for Marx, the world was reality. That was it. There's no other world. What you're trying to do pragmatically by using violence is to act within the world. If you want to change the world, that's magic. That's magic. And sometimes the motivations of the people who recruit the grunts to do the really, wet work are magic. They really think that they can change reality, that they can change the world. And I think this is certainly true in the old days with Marxists, and it's certainly true today with say, Antifa, I'm sure with some of the Islamist terrorists that are still out there. If Shinrikyo were still in business, it would probably be true with them as well. But that's a question of the motivations. It's not simply behavior, and this is where I would say that Voegelin can actually add to the conventional terrorism studies community by saying, look at the motivations as well as the behavior, and that will tell you whether you're dealing with somebody who's just a killer or somebody who's living in a dream world.
Okay, well, I think that nicely moves us towards genocide. So I will turn it over to my colleague Maureen Hebert.
Okay. I was going to say excellent, but of course, genocide, very much not excellent. What I want to talk about, sort of to get into how Voegelin might help us understand specifically genocidal violence, is to turn to his concept of friction. So we've already talked about the idea that political actors can come to hold this second reality conception of the world. But because these views are, as you say, imaginary, they are bound to conflict with common sense reality or just plain everyday reality. And this is what Voegelin calls friction. So in the context of the second reality, violence is is a way of, eliminating this friction or trying to eliminate this friction. But as you note, this gulf between the second reality and actual reality still remains, as I understand it, even when this violence is applied. So let me ask you how this might relate to genocide, which is a kind of a particular form of very extreme violence when it takes a violent form. So let me just kind of propose this to you, and you can tell me what you think Voegelin might say about this. So since genocide involves the intent to destroy a targeted victim group in whole or in part as a group permanently, is genocide a form of violence in which the perpetrator may actually be able, if successful, that is in eliminating the group, to eliminate the friction between the real world and the perpetrator's imaginary world once and for all. And the reason I'm asking you this is my own research into the Holocaust and with comparison to the Khmer Rouge, who we talked about last week or last time, is that each one of them had a kind of what I call epic struggle conception of their relationship with their victims, that this struggle had been going on for decades or even centuries, and now the only way to finally bring it to an end was to use extreme physical violence and other forms of destruction to destroy these groups once and for all.
Okay, I think there are two ways to answer. The simplest one is to say that people who think they are invoking the apocalypse are invariably going to be disappointed.
Right.
It ain't going to happen. The other is a little more specific, and it deals with a dispute that Voegelin and Hannah Arendt had. He reviewed her Origins of Totalitarianism in the Review of Politics about 1952, I think, something like that. It was an early one anyway. And she, you may remember, said that the extermination camps were experiments in changing human nature.
Correct, through total domination, the only places where there was total domination by these regimes.
Yeah, and he said it's a really good book, except when she said that, because that means they are simply ways of destroying human beings. You can't change nature. Is the way he understood it was a solid philosophical Aristotelian concept. You couldn't change nature. This we know from technology that seems not to be true anymore. You can turn cats into dogs if you want to. Then I would say that Voegelin was that he and Hannah Arendt became good friends after that. Although he was very unhappy with what she said in that book. And he certainly praised her Eichmann book. She liked his Hitler and the Germans book, so that they were pals. But what he didn't think about, I guess, is the best way of putting it at the time, was what I would call the Fackenheim Amendment, and that is that the Nazis created enemies in order to kill them. Now, if you do that long enough, you're going to get everybody against you. And I don't know enough about the Khmer Rouge to know if they were doing that too.
Absolutely, very much so, even more than the Nazis, I would say.
Well, that seems to me to be a formula for self-defeat. So that's in the end, there's the friction, because you have this image of the world that doesn't correspond to the world. The world is not filled with your enemies, and yet if you treat them like their enemies, it soon will be. So you get more and more people lined up against you. I mean, that was Fackenheim's original argument about what is so utterly perverse about totalitarian domination, is that it creates its own enemies in order to suppress them or to kill them. And that, when I've taught Hannah Arendt and added Fackenheim into the mix, the students have found that extremely difficult to understand. Like, why would they do that? And that I would say is that they still had a sufficient common sense to resist this kind of imaginative second realities that appeals obviously to somebody.
Now, one of the kind of splits in genocide studies when we try to explain perpetrator behavior, which is the bulk of what genocide studies is about, because it seems like such a crazy thing to do, is a kind of division between those who suggest that genocidal perpetrators, especially at the elite level, are rational or strategic actors, right? That they basically are responding to material conditions in the real world, and then they choose to destroy a group as a means of achieving some other end. So if you have revolutionaries, they calculate that they need to liquidate certain sectors of society because they are counter-revolutionary. They oppose the revolution. And then the other way of explaining it are those who suggest that there are more emotive reasons for why genocidal elites do what they do, right? So they come up with irrational policies grounded on, equally irrational feelings about and conceptions of the victim group. So the perpetrators hate or they fear their victims and believe all sorts of illogical things about them, like the world Jewish conspiracy. So when Voegelin talks about the second reality, does he see those who cleave to this conception of the world as irrational because they believe rather in an imaginary world? Or are they making rational calculations when they use violence, but they're doing it in an altered moral and strategic universe of their own making?
I would say probably the second, because of the capacity of human beings to fool themselves and know that they're fooling themselves and yet do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a very strange, it's not the term that he uses to describe this state of your soul is pneumopathology. And it's a term that Schelling used in the 19th century, in the early 19th century. And it's not psychopathology. The Victorians had a term moral insanity that approximately translates what Schelling was talking about. And what it means is that it's not that you can't tell the difference between right and wrong, which is presumably the problem with psychopaths, but you can. But your soul is so screwed up that it doesn't matter. You know the difference between right and wrong, but you do the wrong thing anyway, often knowing that you're going to be defeated, and you still do it.
Right. So this is sort of reflected in, say, Himmler's speech or infamous speech in 1943 in October of that year to the SS men in Posen. Partway through, he admits that they're exterminating the Jews, and he says that they basically have to finish the job because they will be judged as murderers by history because they all know that they're doing something wrong.
Yeah, and then, I mean, the later statement by Goebbels, history will know we were important because we're slamming the door on our way out.
Right.
That's he wasn't crazy, but there was something wrong with the guy, and it had to do with what Schelling called the perverseness in his soul, not in his brains.
One thing I wanted to just kind of maybe end my line of questioning with is kind of a return to something you had said to Gavin. When Voegelin's trying to account for, I guess, why, in the language I'm using here, perpetrators do what they do, is he mostly thinking about elite actors, that is, those who come up with, in this case, genocidal policies or other violent policies in the first place? Or is he trying to also account for why frontline perpetrators, I think he used the word grunts to describe them, who inflict the actual violence and to account for why they do what they do? And the reason I'm asking this question is the kind of empirical evidence that's drawn from very extensive surveys with people who have been convicted on genocide charges in places like Rwanda, in the Holocaust. The farther down the food chain they are, the kind of wider variety of motivations they have for doing what they do, and the less ideological they are. The higher somebody is up in the command structure, the more unified their motivations, justifications are, and the more highly ideological they are.
Yeah, I think that's empirically that. I don't think anyone would want to dispute that. With ideology at the top, it really is something like Hannah Arendt's logic of an idea, rather than some kind of what I talk about in the ideology class as a kind of convention. But that means that you have to have a commitment to logic as something that's important, and probably the people farther down who are actually doing the terrible activities don't think that much about what they're doing. I think you're absolutely right, and I'm sure that you've got lots of scholarship behind it that says that they do what they do for all kinds of odd reasons. And one of the strangest things about Arendt's book on Eichmann is it's not just the banality of evil. It's become a kind of cliche. It's that Eichmann was a social climber.
Yes.
That's why.
Absolutely.
In his own mind, that was probably why he was doing all of
right.
this
The day that he went to join, or he ended up joining the SS, he was really going to join the Freemasons.
Yeah.
But it didn't work out.
Yeah. So very often the banality deals with the motivations. It's a very strange aspect of political reality that political scientists, by and large, don't pay enough attention to, I'd say.
Absolutely.
Great. And following from my colleagues, I was struck by this hopefulness that seems to be present in Voegelin's thought, but I wasn't quite sure how to make sense of it. And so my final question to you is there a sense in Voegelin of a moral world that will, even when pushed a little off balance, will right itself? When you say the world always is what it is and resists this magical thinking, ultimately defeats any attempts to change it, is that a larger moral claim or vision that Voegelin has, or is it a different kind of understanding of the world?
I would say it's an understanding that that the bad guys don't have much appeal to most people, that nobody's obliged to turn themselves into an ideologist or to believe in a second reality. And the term comes actually from some Austrian novelists. I mean, it's not a social science term. And the people it's from Musil's Man Without Qualities in particular. The people in that book behave in a way that makes them miserable. And there's a similar term that Hannah Arendt uses in her book on Rahel Varnhagen. I can't remember what it is exactly now, but there's a person that Rahel Varnhagen knew who was very much like Ulrich in Musil's book, and the logic in both of their evocations of these kind of personalities is that they're very unsatisfactory. So that there's something in what it means to be a human being that allows you to be attracted to what's true. I mean, this is hardly news, from anyone who's read Plato. And Voegelin has, he's written a great deal on Plato. So that there's, as you said, there might be some reason for hope, but it's not groundless hope. It's based on observation of experience of other human beings, real empiricism, and it's there.
That's perhaps the most hopeful way to end on a note of hope. But actually, before we end, if there is a single insight from Voegelin on violence that you'd like to leave our listeners with, what would that be?
It would be that no one is obliged to give up their common sense and live in a world of their own idiosyncratic fantasies.
Excellent advice. Thank you.
Words to live by.
Words to live by, and hopefully not to die by. Thank you so much, Barry, for joining us. It's been a really wonderful conversation, and we really appreciate you being here in the studio with us.
You're quite welcome. Thank you guys
Thank
for
you.
showing up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Barry will be here at the University of Calgary on June 9th to 10th, 2023 for our Oddities of Violence workshop, made possible through the funding by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. If you want to know more about Barry's work on Voegelin and magical violence, drop by or listen live stream to the workshop. Details will be on our Oddities of Violence website. You have been listening to the Oddities of Violence podcast. Our podcast is produced and edited by Alejandra Vivas. Thank you, Alejandra, with support from the great team at CJSW. Join us for our next episode when we continue with our discussion of terrorism and the oddities of violence in the modern world. Then we'll be looking at the odd case of pre-Holocaust assassinations of senior Nazi and fascist officials and politicians by Jews in 1930s Europe. Our guest then will be Orr Honig from Tokyo International University in Japan, and your host will be Gavin Cameron. Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time.